than most Americans, they can never remember a time when Iran was not America's enemy. Um, um, what what are the structural reasons that the United States has that Iran and America have this enmity? Why is it that successive American presidents, I can only think of Cuba as the closest example of a country that basically, for as long as I can remember, American leaders have been basically either at war with or close to being at war with. What are the fundamental reasons for this?
Well, that's a great question. And the Cuba analogy is bang on. Um, in 1979, Iran had a major revolution. There's a revolution that was very popular. We can talk about its roots and why it ended up becoming a clerical authoritarian regime. But when that revolution took place, Iran emerged outside of the American European geostrategic orbit that previously tied Iran to the West. And I'm talking about the previous regime of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi that came to power, in 1941 when the Americans and the Allies invaded and, installed this young prince in power. And then, of course, in 1953, there was a major event where there was a democratic sort of movement very much in place. The United States intervened to topple the democratically elected prime minister, along with the British, and a brutal authoritarian regime was installed in its place. This was the early days of the Cold War. The Shah was the West's and the United States, favorite ally in the region. He was a key ally in terms of the Cold War. People forget that, the relationships were so deep. I've seen some footage recently that I hadn't seen before. When the Shah of Iran would come to the United States, they would roll out the red carpet. He would get like a heroic welcome, meet with everyone, the media, cultural elites, people on both sides of the political aisle, hailed him as a moderating, sort of a moderate leader who's trying to transform his country in the right direction. And it was a close American ally, purchased all of any armaments he wanted to purchase were sold to him. He was the guardian of American interests in the Middle East. All of that came to an end in 1979 when you had a major revolution that was popular and can be understood, and I think should be understood, really through the prism of sort of anti-imperial, anti-colonial revolutions. I mean, not that dissimilar from the revolution that happened in 1958, 59 in Cuba. And so as a result of that break, that radical rupture, Iran then became, in the context of Middle East politics, an adversary and an open advocate of a different worldview, a revolutionary worldview that drew upon a particular politicized reading of Islam to try and, initiate the type of revolutionary change that most revolutions aspire to accomplish in their early years. They have a vision of, trying to transform the world and in their own, worldview. They have this, claims to justice and political transformation. And of course, the key dividing line was the pro-American regimes that dominated the region. So it was really because of that moment. And if, people who are old enough, this is very much part of my very early sort of formative years. That revolution was deeply tied to a break in diplomatic relations with the United States, but also the capture of the American embassy in Tehran by radical revolutionary leaders that were supported by Iran's revolutionary leadership at the time. And hostages were held for 444 days. Jimmy Carter tried to sort of rescue them. It didn't happen. And then right from that moment on, Iran was viewed, I think, as an enemy of the West, of the United States, because of its ideological orientation. It was both anti-American, anti-Israeli, very vocal in terms of its support for Palestinian national liberation. Yasser Arafat showed up there very quickly in the aftermath of the revolution, was hailed as a hero. They gave him the keys to sort of the Israeli, office, which was really an embassy there. And so that, I think, is the core of the problem in terms of why Iran has been viewed with such disdain. I like to frame it in the following way, just to sum up, that Iran is an independent actor in the politics of the Middle East. And when I say it's an independent actor, I don't necessarily mean it's a good actor, but it doesn't play by the rules of US and European foreign policy. And for that reason, because it challenges American interests, it has generated this deep hostility.
So I think that the way this is often characterized in the United States is that Iran has a desire, particularly to destroy the United States, but because it has would have trouble getting to the United States, that its focus is really on destroying Israel, America's closest ally in the region. And I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit. I mean, what exactly Iran has been willing to do and what Iran hasn't been willing to do in order, it is a regime obviously that would prefer that, that would prefer there were not a state of this kind that exists, right? But in what vis-a-vis Israel, but how has Iran over time approached Israel?
Look, I think if the Iranian leaders theoretically had the capability and the power, they would like to transform the world in the vision of their ideological sort of orientation. The famous slogan of the revolution was, death to America. And death to America, of course, then got misinterpreted, I think, within the American foreign policy debate as sort of death to the existence of the United States as a country, as a nation. It was always understood it was death to the, evil machinations of U.S. foreign policy. That from an Iranian nationalist perspective made perfect sense because the United States was the backer of the Shah regime and kept the Shah in power and presided over a brutal political system replete with torture and corruption and all the rest. So that anti-Americanism, I think, very much is a reflection of the particular relationship that Iran had with the United States. And the revolution was, was birthed through that prism of strong American support. So it was natural that the post-revolutionary Iranian leaders would be antagonistic toward the United States. In terms of Israel, Iran viewed the question of Israel through the prism of third world anti-colonial nationalism. It viewed Israel as a byproduct of Western imperial interests in the Middle East. It had really no understanding or sensitivity to the whole question of how we in the West have historically understood the question of Israel through the prism of the long history of anti-Semitism, discrimination, culminating in the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust. That's because in the Middle East and in much of the global South, the question of anti-Semitism and discrimination is really a European story. It wasn't an Iranian story or an Arab or Islamic world story. I mean, there were, as everyone should know, there were indigenous Jewish communities there that lived in coexistence, not ideally, but with their neighbors. So the whole approach to Israel from an Iranian perspective was really not that different from how many secular nationalist Palestinian factions sort of viewed Israel in the early days as a colonial implant connected to the West. I just happen to be teaching a course that sort of touches on some of this. And when you read the rhetoric of, let's say, someone like Gamal Abdel Nasser, the champion of Arab nationalism, and his depiction of Israel, it's not that different from Ayatollah Khomeini in terms of the, viewing Israel as sort of not being indigenous to the region, being basically an extension of American and European imperial interests. So that's really the point of departure of the approach. But then, of course, the Iranian revolutionary leaders never, when it came to their rhetoric and their language, never really distinguished from. They used interchangeably the word Jew or Jewish when they really were, I think, meaning Israeli. And so it could very easily, they would, engage in this type of rhetoric that could be easily understood as anti-Semitic. When I think really what they were meaning is they were critiquing anti-Israel sort of policies. And one way of, understanding that is Iran, used to have a very sizable Jewish community. Even today, I think after Israel, the largest Jewish community in the Middle East is still in Iran. And while the Jews there don't live in, perfect harmony and peace, they're not being persecuted. They're not being thrown into a ghetto. And most of the Iranian Jews that I've spoken to, they're very proud of being both Jewish and Iranian, and they simply want to live in Iran. And so, you don't see this type of mass anti-Semitic outrage and persecution that sometimes you would think Iran would be pursuing given its anti-Israel rhetoric. So I think the critique of Israel really stems from that sort of revolutionary, anti-colonial, third worldist sort of perspective for which Palestinian rights was viewed through the prism of really this theme of decolonization, and Palestine being one of the last sort of remaining areas in the Middle East that hadn't been granted its independence yet. And so that was a core identity, core sort of pillar of the revolutionary rhetoric of the Islamic Republic that continues until this day. It's foundational to the worldview of the Islamic Republic because it's rooted in this revolutionary anti-American and anti-Israeli perspective. Interestingly, after the Oslo Accords emerged in 1993, there was an internal debate among the senior Iranian leaders. How do we sort of now relate to Israel when the Palestine Liberation Organization is talking to the Israelis? I mean, they were openly saying we're falling into this problem where we could be more Catholic than the Pope, so to speak, in terms of our Palestinian advocacy. And so they've tried to wrestle with that perspective, but they've benefited from, I think, exploiting the legitimate suffering of the Palestinians, which has resonance in the Arab Islamic world, to exploit it to sort of present themselves as the only country in the region that really cares about Palestinian human rights and Palestinian suffering when all of the other Arab dictatorships and regimes have either compromised or given up or struck separate deals with Israel. So like any state, Iran has sort of played an ideological game, seeking to sort of exploit the Palestinian cause for their own advantage, effectively to win street credibility in the Arab world. And that's been part of Iran's relationship to this conflict as well.